For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Now, normally we don't do chat on Saturdays, on weekends, but the oil crisis and the manner in which prices are going up, production appears to be going down. We thought it would be a good idea to just take a quick look at how this crisis is folding and the longer term implications. I have with me Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad. Many of you have seen him on our channel before. He's been India's ambassador to the UAE, to Saudi Arabia. He understands the region well, the geopolitics, and the oil, of course. So we're going to put our questions to him and get some sense as to how this crisis is going to pan out and what are the implications for India. Sir, welcome. Glad to have you again.
Thank you very
Um,
much.
yeah. My first question, sir. The oil crisis today, would you first give us a perspective as to what this crisis is about?
The ongoing oil crisis, made up of restrictions on the supply of Russian oil to the global market and the attendant high prices, is entirely man-made. It is a product of geopolitics. It is a consequence of certain policies adopted by the United States in order to harm Russian interests. On 8th March, about 2 weeks after the initiation of the assault upon Ukraine, the United States unilaterally announced that there would be an embargo on Russian energy supplies. There had been no consultation earlier either with the Europeans, who are crucially dependent on Russian oil, or with the Gulf producers, who are major role players in the global market. So the world was caught by surprise, and as a result there was panic, and immediately prices started going up. Since then, the Americans have put further pressure on the Europeans that they should curtail their import of oil, and reluctantly they have agreed to restrict supplies from Russia, and over a period of time they have pledged that they might in fact completely remove any dependence on Russian supplies. So prices have gone up on the one hand. On the other hand, Russia has retaliated by reducing its exports to European countries on the one hand and massively increasing supplies to China and India. So that Russia is actually doing quite well. It already had a very substantial oil, it had substantial reserves, financial reserves, and indeed their reserves seem to be going up. So in the short term, they are not likely to be harmed at all. The harm is really being experienced in Europe, who are the allies of the United States. I would see this as one more manifestation of completely ill-planned and ill-thought-out policy initiatives that come from Washington, D.C. Now you have the spectacle of the US President now going hat in hand to the Gulf countries and pleading with them, please produce some more oil and save my bacon, because what is happening is oil prices have gone up in the United States, and the Americans are facing, they will be facing midterm elections in November in a deeply polarized country. This will be one more weapon used by Americans against the incumbent president and his party, and you could see the commencement of a lame duck presidency right from the end of this year.
So, sir, Biden is heading for Saudi Arabia to plead for more production. Now, from the buzz that we read in the papers, the increased production may not be possible. Is that how it
You
looks?
see, there is some confusion here. Let us be clear. Initially, Biden had stigmatized the Saudis, spoken of the country as a pariah state, and had
Yeah.
pledged not to have any interaction with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But now, and of course, we also know that sometime in May, he had tried to have a telephonic conversation with Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz as well as Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, but neither had taken his phone call. He was going to plead for increased oil production by these countries as well as by OPEC Plus in general. Now he is going to Saudi Arabia. I am almost certain that the principal item on the agenda will be increased supplies, will be increased production by the Saudis. Now we don't know. There is a news report that President Macron conveyed to President Biden at the recent NATO summit that look, he has spoken to the UAE ruler, President Mohammed bin Zayed, and he has been told that UAE has no spare capacity now. And the prince also did, and the president of the UAE did not even think that the Saudis had that much capacity. In fact, he mentioned a paltry figure of 150,000 barrels per day. Whatever may be the case, the main point is on 30th June, when the OPEC Plus meeting took place, they decided that they are going to stick to their original schedule and will increase production only by 648,000 barrels per day in the month of August, replicating what they had done in the month of July. This is not what the Americans wanted. The Americans wanted the market to be flush with oil, but obviously it is not there. But the point to be noted again is that while OPEC Plus has announced these slight increases in production, actually speaking, they have not met their own target. Many countries have not been able to reach this target for local difficulties. In the case of Libya, there has been conflict. In the case of Iraq, there has been certain domestic disputes between the Iraqi government and the Kurdish government. And again, in the case of Nigeria, there were some local issues as well as in Ecuador. So you have production problems. Even when there is a commitment to increase production, they have not been able to reach it. So you have serious issues globally in the global market. Add to this constraints on the supply of Russian oil, and you are looking at a crisis.
So even the Russians cannot increase production, or they will not increase production?
Well, that is where you have a serious catch-22 scenario. The Russians have a lot of oil, and they produce about 10 million barrels a day. In all of last year, they produced 10 million barrels a day, and a little over half is exported. So they export about 5 million barrels a day. A large part of this goes to China. But Europe is a very major buyer as well. More than half the Russian exports actually go to Europe. Now therefore there has been less demand from Europe. Russia has said that that despite the constraints on supplies to the European market, they have not actually reduced production, that they are actually still producing what they used to do earlier. But I believe that over a period of time, possibly sometime next year, as the embargo on Russian supplies to Europe become even more effective, you could see a slight reduction in Russian supply. But there is another point to be noted, and that is Russia may deliberately reduce its exports to the European market in order to put an economic squeeze upon the Europeans. You see, the Europeans have blithely and enthusiastically gone along with Biden and have made very grandiose promises that they are going to reduce their dependence on Russia. Russia may preempt this by itself reducing supplies. You will then have a crisis. The global, JP Morgan has said that if Russia reduces production by, say, 3 million barrels a day, you are looking at prices nearly reaching about $200 per barrel. And if they reduce supplies by 5 million barrels per day, you are looking at $350 per barrel. So you are looking at very serious problems for the global economy, to my mind, entirely manufactured thoughtlessly in Washington, D.C.
Is there any prospect of oil from Iran, Venezuela re-entering the market, because these countries are also under US sanctions?
That is an irony, isn't it? That the Americans, for their own domestic reasons, have imposed sanctions on the Iranians. They withdrew from the nuclear agreement and imposed these sanctions in 2018. These sanctions have certainly hurt the Iranians, But they have also hurt the international community to the extent that one of the world's major producers is not able to sell his oil. Again, you have the same situation with regard to Venezuela. So you have, and now Russia. So three major global producers find that the global market is denied their production because of unilateral American policies. You know, it's an extraordinary irony that the world is paying such a high price. Actually, we had barely recovered from the pandemic. We were looking at a very uncertain outlook. Omicron had entered the world and was raging all across in terms of widespread infections, and there was certainly uncertainty. There were also reports about some other mutations emerging that could be even more virulent. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the Americans have created a serious energy crisis. The American president has said that the responsibility lies with Russia, Russia, Russia. But this is a mindless remark. It really lies in him personally and his own country. You can't get away from your responsibility in that regard. Therefore, I am led to believe there could be a correction. It is not something that the US president or his government may have wanted, but I have a sneaking suspicion that you just could see the nuclear agreement being revived because the pressure is far too great. The Americans desperately need Iranian oil. Iran also needs to sell its production in the global market, so they may be encouraged. We don't know on what terms and conditions this will happen, but news reports indicate certain diplomatic activity. There was an attempt to patch up differences in Qatar. A bilateral meeting between Iran and the United States took place in Qatar. We are told it was not successful, but there are positive statements coming from both sides. Europeans are very active. They are the ones most adversely affected, and they are pretty active also in behind the scenes diplomacy. The divide is very deep. I am not going to pretend to you that it's simple. For several months, we have not been able to see progress, largely on issues that impinge on the domestic politics of both countries. As far as United States is concerned, the president finds it very difficult to remove Iran from the foreign terrorist organization category. It has only symbolic value, no real impact, because there are sanctions on the IRGC because of various other initiatives from the American side. But this symbolic factor is very important because the right wing, particularly the Republican Party, is going to take advantage of this to hammer the president if he removes the FTO, the designation from the IRGC. From the Iranian side, you have a similar problem. The IRGC and the right wing in Iran are also very, very, very upset. Their general was assassinated. Various scientists have been killed. They don't want to see concessions to the Americans as well. So you have this problem of domestic politics coming in the way of a reasonable revival. Let us see where it goes. I think the pressure on both sides to actually have an agreement and ease the global energy scenario might finally triumph. I am trying to be optimistic in this regard.
So in this context, I mean, India, which is a net importer of oil, and there is a crisis in fuel pumps in the country. Where do we stand? Where do we go? What are our options?
See, India is an integral part of the global energy economy. We don't produce enough for our needs. We import more than 80%. According to projections, this import bill that we might start importing even 90% in due course as our own domestic production slides downwards. So India is very much buffeted by the swings that take place in the global market. We are experiencing a very small respite. I believe it's a short-term respite that we are able to buy oil from the Russians at a concessional price. I think it is a short-term scenario, and we are likely to be quite seriously affected You see, at the end of the day, energy is a fuel. It fuels your economy. And whatever plans you have with regard to production as well as with regard to agriculture, you are dependent on energy. And because you're dependent on energy, you have to ensure that you get energy supplies in adequate quantities, but you have to pay the price. And this is what I am worried about, that India is also likely to be affected by global high prices. Is not something that we can avoid. We are experiencing a positive scenario where Russia is concerned. I want to add one small point. My own impression is that when Iran supplies to India, we also get some pretty attractive terms of trade. We denied ourselves these advantages when we went along with the American sanctions and reduced imports from Iran to zero. But I think that as and when the Iranian oil starts coming back into the market, possibly, just possibly, the Iranians may give us the same good terms of trade that we enjoyed earlier, where we could pay for Iranian oil on the basis of deferred payment, and then we were able to monetize the crude oil, have a refined product, sell the refined product, and then pay for the crude oil much later. So I hope that with concessional Russian oil as well as with good terms of trade from the Iranians, we might get some minor respite. But do recall, you have to see this in context. India is a very major importer of oil. It is, I think, the second or third largest in the world after China. And therefore, there is not going to be any shortcut. We are still going to have a very heavy burden on our exchequer.
Do you see India buying more US oil, American oil?
See, I never took that particularly seriously. That was a certain, it was loaded with regard to politics. It was part of the game plan in both countries to bring India and the United States close to each other. And for a short period, America became a very major supplier as well. But there is no shortcut again in this regard. The Gulf countries will remain the principal source of our oil. The GCC countries already meet more than 50% of our requirements. If you add Iraq and Iran, you are looking at even 70% and possibly nearer 80%. All the other suppliers are marginal suppliers. They meet our needs on the basis of spot purchases. But the long-term agreements that we have are with Gulf countries. There is no escaping that situation even in the long term. So we will continue to buy from the Gulf. We will also buy from other countries. I recall that in 2020, we had 40 countries supplying oil to India, but the top 10 met 80% of our requirements. So I would say that yes, we will continue to buy oil from different sources, but the principal supplies will still come from the Gulf.
And assuming there is some a conflict of some kind in the Gulf region, then again, everything goes for the six.
Well, this is an anxiety that we have had. But I also want to remind you that despite the instability in the Gulf over such a long period of time, supplies to India were not disrupted over the longer term. Do
Yeah.
recall here we experienced in the 1980s the Iran-Iraq war as well as the global jihad in Afghanistan. After that, we had the occupation of Iraq, of Kuwait by Iraq, and the two principal suppliers could not supply to us. We had the no-fly zone and the sanctions inspection regime all through the 1990s. What used to happen is that whenever a particular country could not meet our needs, some other country came in. So when Iraq occupied Kuwait and our two principal suppliers could not supply to us, Saudi Arabia entered the picture and became the principal supplier to us. And indeed, over a period of time, we used to meet 25% of our requirements. Now it meets 18% of our requirements. Iran became a very major supplier. And then as peace descended upon Iraq, which used to be our number one supplier all those years ago, now became a major supplier, and today it is possibly number two. So you have Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and hopefully in the near future Iran as
Iran.
meeting our needs. What concern we have in terms of observing events in the region is whether there is a region wide conflagration. We came close to that on a few occasions in the last decade, particularly during the period of Donald Trump. We were brought very close because he followed policies of brinkmanship and provocation. There used to be concerns at that time that possibly certain sections of the Israeli community might have been encouraging him to carry out these provocations. But we know that neither the Iranians, nor the Saudis, nor the Americans, and not even the Israelis actually wanted a region wide conflagration.
Yeah.
But that anxiety remains because you know that a conflagration can happen on the basis of a very small matchstick ignition, and we
Yeah.
have to worry about that. Indeed, I used to argue very strongly that India has such high stakes in the peace and stability of the region that it should be an active role player to promote peace on the basis of its diplomatic initiatives. None of this happened, as you know, and the region somehow is now engaged in fresh diplomacy amongst themselves. The countries among themselves are engaged in diplomacy. You've had 5 rounds of meetings between the Saudis and the Iranians. You have the Turks now engaged with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. You also have Israel seeking to normalize ties with certain Arab countries. So you have major diplomatic initiatives taking place in the region which are outside the American scenario, and therefore you find that the region seems to be coming of age and now taking responsibility for regional security on the basis of its own initiative. I think that is something to be welcomed, but I would still say that the problems are not over.
Yeah.
Israel remains an extremely belligerent presence in the region. It continues to carry out provocative acts. It has assassinated scientists recently and various other people. A colonel was assassinated a short while ago. It continued its aggressive and provocative policies in Palestine. And therefore, regardless of the so called normalization with a few countries, the overall scenario in West Asia remains uncertain and possibly turbulent. Therefore, I do believe that even now, India, with certain Asian partners, should become a little more actively involved in a diplomatic effort in the country, in the region, and to see how, or taking advantage of the status that we enjoy in the region, we can promote peace and stability in the region, address some of the issues. There are issues of insecurity all across. There are suspicions. Mutual trust is absent. All of these are well within our diplomatic capacity, and I would encourage us to really take a fresh look rather than sit outside the framework and not participate in something so significant. If I would also like to add that if we remain complacent and outside the regional framework, there will be other real role players who will emerge. I would say to you immediately and very frankly, it could be Russia and China playing an
Yeah.
active role. They're actively involved with the region already. They have very substantial ties with the region. They are competing with the Americans for a new world order. And I believe that this region, or which you can refer to collectively as Eurasia, is central to the making of a new world order led by China and Russia. In this scenario, I find that it is unacceptable for India to be confining itself to domestic issues rather than actively involving itself within the neighborhood that is of such crucial importance to us.
On that note, sir, so from what I gather now, the issues are difficult, the road ahead is uncertain, full of obstacles, but there is light on the horizon, assuming common sense prevails.
Yeah.
And a
There
lot of
are
the
many
common
issues.
sense, I think, hinges on the Americans too, for them to, bring some
Very
reason
difficult
to
to
this
predict which way
entire
things
region.
will go. You are absolutely right in your analysis and diagnosis. very difficult to predict where things will go.
Yeah. Anyway, sir, thank you very much.
Thank
Great
you.
insight and great perspective. Thanks again,
Thank you
sir.
very much. Thank you for the invitation. I wish you all the best.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media, Instagram and Twitter. Thank you and good night.